All right, thank you very much. Thanks, Ian. My name's Chris Power, so I'm from the AbleGamers charity, and what I wanted to talk to you today about was why we play together. Now, I hate slides like this. I hate them, but I absolutely have to do it because this is the first time I've had the opportunity to speak to this audience, and I'm very grateful for that. So, my name is Chris Power, and I am the Vice President of the AbleGamers charity, and our charity works to create opportunities to enable play and combat social isolation and foster inclusive communities so that we can improve the quality of life for people with disabilities. I'm very lucky to work with this organization and have for about 3 years now. I originally joined the organization because of my day job. In my day job, I'm an associate professor at the University of York, and a lot of the work I talk about today is joint between those two organizations, where I've worked as a UX researcher in accessibility for the last about 12 years, originally coming from London, Ontario, Canada, which is why I have the funny accent and it doesn't sound like I'm from the UK. I did my PhD in London, Ontario, which causes absolutely no confusion at the border of the UK. And I also originally started working in tactile technology, looking at how do we do tactile audio books and diagrams, then moved into the web and have now made my way to in front of you people today. I'm also, if you follow me on Twitter, you may know that I'm a giant comic book nerd, and there may be a few references to that in here. So, as I mentioned, I started my journey in accessibility looking at very different technologies from games. And when I think a lot about interactive technologies in general, they serve a very different purpose from games. But it took me a while to kind of put my finger on why. When we think about interactive technology in general, whether it's an ATM or a streaming service on your TV or a website to help us pay our taxes, it is something that's meant to do a job, a task of some kind, or to help us do a task better. And that has framed a lot of our accessibility work since the 1960s. When we look at programming for programmers who were blind in the 1960s working on punch cards, it was about doing the thing. It wasn't about experience of any kind. And sometimes when we look at things like the web, it's about trying to get us to do the thing. It's about headings or links or the structure on the site, and those types of things really help in getting the thing done. But games don't work that way. And they aren't about doing a thing. So some games, like the Kerbal Space Program, they're kind of about doing a thing. They're about learning. They're about learning about space. But that's not why people play Kerbal. Because if it was just about learning space, then I'd be able to get my kids to do it more. But it's not. Games are about something else. And they're really about having different types of experiences. Now, why is that important? Well, I think it's important because it has to do with how we measure success around accessibility. All of our accessibility work in other technologies is always measured around a success of some kind, where someone can do a thing. And in games, we don't have that measure. So we need to start thinking about how do we measure success when we come to games. Now, when we think broadly about games, generally we think about the types of experiences that people want to have. Now, I can't speak to anyone else in the room, so I'll just talk through the things that I like to do in games. So it might be that I want to drive a car really, really fast that I can't possibly afford through the medieval city that I live in. They probably won't let me do that, and in truth, probably I couldn't drive the car that's on the screen right now anyways. But Forza lets me do that. And success is measured in whether I can feel that I'm driving this powerful automobile. Now, that's very different from the experience that I have in Mass Effect. Whereas Shepard, with my ragtag band of aliens, I get to protect my home from the evil aliens that are out there. And that's a very different type of experience. It's an adventure that I can take part in with my friends Talia and Liara, who are going to help me. Or I can play with my wife in Dragon Age, and we can go hunt dragons. And that's pretty exciting. For those who know this game, if you're a mage like me, you're probably the one that's standing in the fire. But that's okay, because that's a fun experience in itself. Or the thing that I like the best is that I get to be a superhero. I get to not only beat up on bad guys, but I get to live in the worlds that I actually loved as a kid. And I get to scale Avengers Tower as Spider-Man. That's a thing I can do. That's a pretty cool experience to have. None of these things are about success as we tend to think of them, like paying our taxes, where I can press submit and, hey, my taxes are paid. Boy, that was a fun thing to do. Instead, it's more about having this broad range of different experiences. So why is that important? Well, I think that it has to do with how we talk about games and how we frame accessible design. When we frame accessible design and whether or not people can do a thing, it actually kind of limits our design a little bit, because we're no longer asking the question as to whether or not people are having the experience that they want to have. And for me, that's the more important thing. Whether or not someone can move Shepard in Mass Effect is a first step. But really, if they're not having that spacefaring adventure that they want to have, then the game isn't really accessible to them. And so today, at an accessibility conference, I'm not going to talk a lot about accessibility. I'm going to talk about player experience. I'm going to talk about what I call accessible player experiences, where players can have the experiences they want to have free from the accessibility barriers in games. Before I go any further, it's really important that I talk about our team. So I work with a really, really great group of people who are up on the slide now. There's Paul Cairns, who's a reader at the University of York with me. He's an expert in player experience and turned me on to this idea about how important experiences are to think about and measure. And we started working about 5 years ago in this area and began to build out our own measures around experience. And we've started working very heavily with the community of players with disabilities to find out what experiences they want to have in games. And that's part of what this presentation is about. We both work with a very, very bright PhD student who's part of our Intelligence Games and Games Intelligence PhD program at the University of York, Jen Beeston. The statistics that I'll present in the early part of this presentation come from her PhD and are available, as some of you have seen online, through a white paper that we published. And Jen laid a lot of the foundation work for this, and I can't thank her enough for that work. We also have our team from AbleGamers, Mark Barley, who's the founder and executive director of our charity, and the work that we're doing, he helps us contextualize in the broader game industry with the experience that AbleGamers has had since 2004. And we have two really great people working with us to help us collect data. We have Greg Haynes, who's our lead user experience researcher, and Craig Kaufman, who's our community specialist. And they helped collect a lot of the data that you'll see later in this presentation, where we work both with players from our Player Panels program, as well as players at one of the big PAX conferences in the US. So, the real people I have to thank, though, are the people who participate in our AbleGamers Player Panels. So for those of you who don't know, Player Panels started in spring of 2017, where we were hearing all kinds of things from the industry. We were seeing that shift that Ian talked about, where people wanted to work with players with disabilities, both in terms of understanding through user research and doing testing of their games. But there was no route to do that. And so we came up with this crazy idea that we could set up a matchmaking service between players and the industry. And Mark and I had a bet. I said that if we had 30 people, then we could count it as a success. And he said, well, no, I bet we can get 50. And in a really surprising moment, we had 120 people sign up in the first 24 hours. And we were floored. And we had to rework the website so it could handle that. And we had to find a slightly different way to do it. But after that, the signups kept rolling in. And since that time, we've had over 400 players sign up. We have 350 active members. And we've worked with 15 projects, which included the testing of the Xbox Adaptive Controller, which I insist on calling the ZAC. I know no one else does, but I'm trying to make that a thing. You call it the ZAC? Oh, wow, that's fantastic. I win. That's really exciting. So it was really a great opportunity to kick those panels off with that project. And we've done a number since with a number of studios, as well as providing routes into the broader game industry. So talking about that, and with all those players, we did a bunch of work around May of this past year where we pulled out a census of those who signed up, which was about 230 people at that time. And we identified different aspects of the demographic questionnaire that Jen had put together. Now, Jen worked with players, testing the questions really carefully, worked with people in the industry to make sure that it actually was the case that we were asking the things that were important for them to be able to select players. And then we trialed all of this very carefully, and we ended up with some really interesting data out of it. So I just want to go through a few of those things here. So the first thing is that our players are playing huge numbers of games. We were surprised at the variety and the differences between the games that they were playing. There were 3 games that rose to the top. Now, they only rose to the top in that they sit at around 15%. Now, the reason that they sit that low is because of the huge numbers of different games that people were playing. And that was an immensely exciting thing to see. This kills the myth forever that there's only a few games that players with disabilities play. They're playing across the industry, and they're playing some of the most important titles. So we had about 15% of players playing Destiny 2. We had 14% of players playing World of Warcraft, which is one where I spent way too many hours, so I'm absolutely thrilled to see that. And Overwatch, which is a game that I'm told that actually I have to play and haven't, so it's something that I'm putting on my to-do list. But 13% of our players play that. So this was really exciting to see, and this type of diversity in gaming is something that we're seeing quite a lot, not only in the types of players that we work with, because we have players from across the different groups of people with disabilities, but also in the games that they play. Now, I could put up stat after stat after stat, but I'm not going to do that today. I'll leave that for you to read. Instead, I'm going to hit on some of the really interesting highlights from here. So people often ask us about what options do players with disabilities use in games, and what's the one option I should be doing? Well, I'm not sure that I can answer that. And sometimes they come and they ask, well, what's the one option that I should be doing for people with physical disabilities or people with hearing disabilities? And I say, well, just put the options in and let them choose. Let people choose, let the players choose what they want to use. Because each person may have differences in the types of things that they want to play in each game. Now, when we look, though, and we talk to people, we ended up with some interesting statistics. So 32% of our users use assistive technology of different types. So that's looking at alternative to switches, looking at eye gaze technology, things where we've changed the technology of the system that they're working on. 67% of people use software options. They use different types of accessibility options to either bypass content in the game, help them level the playing field a bit, or looking at ways to access different channels, like subtitling. We had 51% of people talk about key remapping. Now, a lot of our players are people who have physical disabilities, and in particular, physical disabilities in their upper limbs, and as a result, we expected that number to be quite high. So we have about 120 people right now who describe themselves as being those people who use key mapping. On the other hand, we had subtitling, which came in at 47%. Now, this is quite shocking to us. Not shocking in that we're surprised by the result, because we knew that subtitling was popular, but we didn't realize how popular. Because within this sample of players, this 230 players, there was a very small number of people with hearing disabilities and a very small number of people who were deaf. And as a result, we have a huge cross-section of the player base using what is traditionally thought as a very specific accessibility option. So this is what I mean when I say we can just let players choose what they want. And we find a similar thing with recoloring options, where 20% of our players, even though only about 4% identify as having color vision deficiencies, they use those recoloring options. Now, I don't know why they're using these things, and that's an interesting question that I want to follow up on, simply because, number one, it might inform different types of player experience research or game design, but also because it would be nice to be able to tell those stories. One of the other things that we looked really closely at in this survey is something that we didn't really originally set out to do, but it was something that came out of the work that we did early on with players piloting and with things about what developers were interested in. And one of the things they were interested in was who are players with disabilities playing with and how are they playing. There's a lot of myths around that players with disabilities primarily play self-paced games. They play things that are turn-based. They don't play online. They play individual single-player games. And we've largely found that our players are like other players. They play across a huge number of platforms. They play in many different arenas, and they play both competitive and cooperative multiplayer. On the screen right now is a clustered bar chart where I present where we have real-life friends as one set of bars, online friends as another, and strangers. Now, I tell my kids they shouldn't play with strangers, but it turns out a lot of our players do. So that's a good thing. And local multiplayer, primarily people play with their friends and family, which we might expect. This is the living room play. This is the basement play. This is probably playing at your office with other people on your mobile phone, playing things like Space War. We then also, or Space Team. But when we move to online multiplayer, we actually find that people are playing with huge numbers of people across the three groups of real-life friends, online friends, and strangers. But what wins out is groups of friends online. So we're talking things like guilds, societies, alliances. These are the types of things that we heard people talking about. And we do find that they're playing with a large number of people in an ad hoc basis, where they're jumping online like everyone else and just getting thrown into a match with people that they may not know. And that's really fun. So we know from this data and from lots more data that we're collecting that players with disabilities are playing a huge numbers of games. But what types of experiences are they seeking? I've told you early in the presentation what I like to do in games. But what are the experiences that players with disabilities are looking to experience? One might hope that it looks very much like everyone else, but it would be naive for us to say that everyone is like everyone else. The lived experiences of people with disabilities is very different in many arenas, and there's no reason that would be the same in games. So how do we answer these things? Well, always go back and talk to the players, because they'll tell us their story. But what we wanted to do this time was reach out more broadly, and we wanted to be able to look at both the experiences of players with disabilities and those who don't identify to us that they necessarily have a disability. And that's why we went out and asked a very different question. Instead of talking about specific types of experiences that people have like we did in our survey, for example, 98% of people said they had fun. Well, that's good. I'm excited by that. And we've picked out a number of other key stats from that as well, but we don't know what we were missing. So what we did was we asked players, why is gaming important to you? And we did this with our player panels, and we had 122 respondents, which was way more than I expected. I keep massively underestimating how passionate the players are. And we had them from across the different groups that are in the player panels. And we also, at PAX East, pulled people aside and we asked them this question on video. Now, we didn't collect any demographics of these people, but we tried to get a mix of men and women. We tried to get a mix of people who identified themselves as different types of gamers, but we didn't ask specific disability information. As you might expect, some people did tell us about their disability. And it was interesting because we used some of those answers to validate what we found in our player panels as well. So what I want to do is talk a little bit about the 122 player panel members and our 71 PAX East members or attendees who shared with us their information. But we wanted to make sure this was done in a very rigorous way. So what our team did was we did a thematic analysis on it. Now, this is a technique where you immerse yourself in the data and you try to pull out themes that come across the different things. And we had the comments from the player panels that were in text from an open answer question, and we had these lovely videos where people told us their stories about why games were important to them. And so after immersing ourselves in the data, we conducted the analysis of the player panel data, and we pulled out a set of codes which looked at the key concepts that came out. We then took those same codes and applied them to the PAX data, and we refined them, and we merged a few of them, and we began to hear commonality between the groups, but also some things that were different, and that was what excited us. We did some reliability checking, which if you were my students in class, I would be going over the equation as to how we did that, but I won't do that right now, because, well, that would probably bore you to tears. And then after this, we had a set of thematic groupings. And those thematic groupings told us the stories about why our players in general play games and why games are important to them. And primarily, we were interested in what experiences do they talk about, because that's what we're trying to target as game designers. So what I'd like to do is go through the different themes with you very quickly, looking at some of the quotes from our players. And I can't emphasize enough that none of this happens without everyone sharing these amazing stories. And I'm really appreciative to our players for doing that. So the first theme that came out was connecting. Games are about connection. They're about that social contact with other people. And we saw that in our multiplayer data. And indeed, when we looked at the types of answers that we had previously, lots of people talked about connecting with a community. 70% of our players on the player panels talked about that or chose that option. And also that they did it to socialize. 65% of our players said that. So to see this theme come through really strongly was not surprising, but very comforting that what we were doing was working. And you have people like our PAX player who talks about the fact that because of the communities they create, the shared experience you can gain through play and game, and through playing, like any intimate experience, and there's that word again, that you can only really get through games that brings other people together. Now, the nice thing about PAX is it's a community in itself, so they talked really passionately often about that broader community, where it was everyone together, and we heard the word universal quite often in it, which was really nice. We also had our player panels say similar things. I can use gaming to socialize with my friends who also enjoy gaming, and we can enjoy and play games together and bond through having fun and overcoming challenges. Now that's a really nice story that we hear from this player in our player panels, because it hits on those key things about what games are about. It's about sharing an experience. It's about overcoming challenges together in the game. And I love the idea that it's something that they bond over, because it's not only bonds in the game, but games give us something to bond over outside in our lives. A number of players talked about diversion, that games provide a type of immersion from them. And again, when we had asked the player panels before, we did have 86% of our players say as their number 2 reason that they game was the fact that they do it to relax. And this idea of de-stressing came up again and again. And for both sets of players, our player panels, for example, one of our users said, it helps me wind down after a hard day's work. And our PAX attendees, we heard things like, when I'm feeling anxious or nervous, I play games for stress relief. And this is very much looking at stress in the very colloquial sense. It's something that we look at in our day-to-day lives that we want to escape. And games, certainly for me, it's someplace that I can retreat to when the world gets to be a little too much. But that diversion went deeper than this, because the players talked a lot about escape. And this was a word that kept coming up again and again. And this was a really important word that we thought, because people used it in a couple of different ways. Whoops, one of my quotes didn't appear. Whoops, there we go. For our PAX player, for example, here on the slide, there's some other world that we can jump into to allow us to experience many different lives that you would never be able to experience in the real world. Again, that's me driving the Bugatti Veyron down the main streets of York. They won't let me do that. For good reasons. And so that notion of being able to jump into a world, and people talked about fantasy games, and they talked about space games, and they talked about exploring the galaxy. But also, our players talked about escape in a different way. It was sometimes about escaping different aspects of their lives. Sometimes it was political, sometimes it was economic, and for some of our player panels members, it was intimately related to their disability. So we had one of our player panel members say, it allows travel to a different world, and it's extra nice when it's hard to go out in real life. It relieves the sameness of sitting in the chair all day. This type of escape, where the real world falls behind and we end up with true immersion in a game, is one of the powers that games have that are compared to things like books or movies, and we started to hear players talk in that way. And indeed, that was the next broad theme, was that while it wasn't dominant in the data, there was a consistent feel that games were part of our shared culture. Games were art. They were meant to be experienced by people in a variety of different ways, and that no one should be closed off from having access to that art. And in a sense, this is perhaps one of the real powers of games, that we can experience and feel the creativity of others. And be that games themselves, or the community around gaming that streams, or people who just talk about games in their office, it's something that we're all starting to share with billions of gamers worldwide. And our player panels member talks about it as a cultural enrichment. Games can have beautiful, touching, and clever stories, which I love. And the art in games often is just as inspiring as any art in a museum. This type of artistic experience is a very different type of eudaimonic experience. It's not about fun, necessarily. It's about an appreciation of the creativity of others. And we hear it gives an outlet to express creativity and experience the creativity that other people decide to create from one of our PAX members. A number of players talked about how games were beneficial to them. And this type of benefit came in a couple of different ways. Some of them are the types of education that a lot of games research talks about, and what I talked about with the Kerbal Space Program, that it's about being able to learn and extend your own boundaries. And we had one player panel member talk about how they started studying English when they were a child because of games, and now I'm studying Japanese because of games. And that's quite a nice story. The games are inspiring to broaden their horizons. Meanwhile, others talked about specific skills, so problem-solving skills, such as our PAX player, that they help to work on problem-solving skills. And some talked about reflexes, and some talked about being able to identify with different types of people. And it's when we started hitting those non-tangible benefits that it got really interesting. Because people talked about being able to put themselves in other people's shoes, which in today's day and age is maybe really important. And it also is probably something to do with how do we understand our structure, our communication and relationships. And players talked about games being a safe space where they could try on new pieces of their personality or explore facets of who they were without having to be judged by the broader world. So this is a pretty exciting type of thing. Now, you probably noticed that at this point, I've not talked about a lot of the core things that we tend to think about in games. We don't talk about the challenges in problem solving or the reflex puzzles, or I talked in passing about some of the narrative experiences, and we did hear about people overcoming challenges together. But these broad themes that I've just gone over dominated the data. You didn't hear people saying, I go in to have a challenge. Except you did, in a very specific way. When we looked at the data really carefully, we had people talking primarily in our player panels, talking about how games enabled them. They talked about having autonomy in games. They talked about having the challenge that they could rise to on a level playing field with everyone else. And they made sure to communicate the fact that their competence and skill in the game was something that they thought was really important to them. And the really interesting thing about this theme is that enablement only came through with our players with disabilities. It's something that they deeply value and is so important to them. One of the really interesting things was we did hear this also from our PAX members. There were a handful of people, while talking to us, probably because of who we are, began talking to us very openly about their disability. And when they spoke to us and we looked at their quotes about why games were important, they told stories about when they were enabled. And in some cases, this was about having communication because they had a hearing disability and needed to push out to socialize. In another case, it was someone who had mental health issues and they needed to push out to have a place that they could get past the hard times. These were powerful stories that came from both sets of our players, but were primarily from our core groups of players with disabilities. So we talked about things like Overwatch is one of the first games that puts me on the same level as my abled friends. And that was one of our key player panel members who wrote tons for us. And games are important because of my limited mobility. I am able to go places and do things that I cannot do in reality. And as we look across these different themes, the really important thing I feel is that players with disabilities want to have experience that lead them feeling enabled through play. That is the top line item if I could have anyone take this away. It's about feeling that autonomy to be able to do things. It's about having strong competencies and having those connections with others. And that connection with others leads to different types of benefits that people can feel from their time played. Most of all, we're sharing an enriched cultural experience through the art and creativity of others. And for a number of our players, both in player panels and at the PAX East attendees, they talked about the fun and the enjoyment in games and the fact that for many of them, it was a way of life. It was something they had done since they were children. It was their primary hobby. It was who they identified as. So why did I tell you all of this sitting at an accessibility event where we normally talk about the different types of options? I think those things are still important. They're unbelievably important because they're the gateway to getting access to games. If we don't provide the accessibility options in our games, none of these experiences can happen. But I think the challenge going forward is we need to be thinking about these experiences as a core part of our game design. An accessible player experience where players can have the experience that they want to have, free from barriers that are related to their disability, is really important because it frames game design then in the experiences of players, which is, in my experience talking to game designers, how they think about it anyways. It brings our players closer to the main design process. It's no longer an add-on, it's no longer an extra feature. These are the experiences we're targeting. But I will say this, we don't have a lot that helps us with this. Currently, our methodologies and our measurements don't talk a lot about those types of experiences. And in particular, how do we measure that success? How do we establish that players are having those experiences they want to have? And I think that's the challenge for the next stage of accessibility, and I hope you all come along with me so we can all play together. Thank you very much.